soybeans, clover, hay, and cover crops. Throughout Tompkins County and in the Finger Lakes. They process, clean, and ship food-grade grains ready for small flour mills, bakeries, malt houses, distilleries, and breweries to use. And soil health is their top priority. So, take it away, Thor.
All right. Thanks, everybody. It's good to be at a conference again. It's been a long time since the pandemic, and thank you, Aaron, for inviting me. So I'm going to actually cover. I think Jean Paul did an excellent job of going over a lot of what I would consider key things, and I've been doing field crop farming for over 30 years, and I'm still learning. And these are things that we learned along the way, and there's always more research being done, more ways of tackling weed problems. And I'm not going to stand here and say that we've figured this all out. That's why I'm saying this is attempts at cultural weed control, because we're still learning. And I think for me as a farmer, that's what I really enjoy about it, is every year something different. You're never going to figure the thing out, and it schools you each time you think you figured it out. And so these are some of the things I've learned, and hopefully they'll be helpful. So this is just a picture of our farmer in the Finger Lakes, cash crop farm, focusing on food grade, as he said. Again, these are some of the crops we're growing, and you can see we're growing mostly for the food grade market. I don't know if you mentioned it, but I also have a flour mill, and we're milling flour and shipping it all over the Northeast. So, part of having a good crop rotation is having a variety of crops, obviously, but you also have to be able to market those crops. So when we started thinking about this, it was also thinking about, okay, we're going to grow some of these things, but they also have to pay their way. And how do we market those? So part of having a good cultural weed control program is, obviously, for me, the biggest thing is a good crop rotation. But that also, if you start working it back, you have to have markets to be able to sell some of this stuff. These are some of the cover crops that we use on our farm as the main ones. And a lot of this is the same stuff that's going to be covered here and what Jean Paul talked about, but really crop rotation is the key, and diversity is the key. And that goes for us. We're planting a lot of grasses, so we need to work in other crops for disease control, and then having crops that are planted at different times of the year, different tillage events at different times of the year. All of that, I've found, is really important to keep weeds off balance. If you're going to plant corn and soybeans every year, and think about when you're doing your tillage and when you're doing your planting, there's no way you're not going to end up with a problem in my book. And without really spreading out these tillage and planting dates, I don't see how we keep weeds under control. Other thing that Jean Paul hit on is nutrient demand. I work with the long-term organic cropping systems trial at Cornell, and one thing we found there is that excess phosphorus in particular really brings on the weeds. So I've made a lot of mistakes in over-fertilization, and Jean Paul alluded to that in his veg crops, where this becomes a real problem. So when we set up our crop rotation, we want to look at that and rotate heavy feeders with light feeders with medium feeders, so that we're not just increasing the soil phosphorus and the soil fertility, but drawing it down and bringing it up and drawing it down. And I think that's important in terms of keeping weeds in check. Like Jean Paul said, a bare fallow period is super important for us, because these perennial weeds creep into a system, particularly an organic system. You don't have glyphosate or some other weed control that can translocate down into the stolons and rhizomes. We need to have in our rotation a period where we can do a lot of tillage, and by making that plant continue to grow and not letting it photosynthesize, we're able to draw a lot of the root reserves out of the rhizomes or stolons, and then by putting in a smother crop, really able to do quite a nice job of controlling that type of weed. Another big thing is know thy enemy. I've spent a lot of time and I think this is really a fascinating part of farming, is reading about weed ecology and figuring out, okay, how does this thing grow and what different things can I do to try to control it? Again, cover crops are really important. Always want to have competition. And after listening to John Paul, I feel like I've got it pretty easy because a lot of my crops are very competitive. Another thing you talked about was seed shed, and I feel like this is really important. If you look at how long some of these weed seeds last in the soil, it's really important to not let them go to seed. We spend a lot of time mowing, and we actually hand weed a lot of our wheat fields where we've got wild radish or vetch or something like that. You know, we'll go out in the evenings, make a couple of gin and tonics, walk across the field, pull weeds. We get a bunch of friends together. It can be kind of a fun thing to do in the evening. You got to make this kind of bludgeon stuff fun. But we do go out and hand weed our fields. And you know, this many little hammers approach is really, I think, key. Like doing a lot of small things right all add up to keeping weeds in check as best as you can in an organic system. So this is just a little graphic of our crop rotation: corn to buckwheat to winter grain to clover to spring wheat to another winter grain. But you can see here where this is where we're planting, the planting windows, and you can see through that rotation, you know, besides the winter grain and the red clover, which is frost seeded, where we don't have any tillage event, we're varying always when we're planting. And I feel like over the years, as I've developed this rotation, this has been really key to, you know, you're not going to eliminate weeds, but just keep them down to a point where they're not economically a problem. So I'll go through this rotation a little bit more in detail right now. So if we started with year one, we would have corn in, which is a heavy feeder, planted in mid-May, as you all know. And then we'll go through and we'll seed an annual ryegrass into the corn and glass cultivation. And what this does is it helps cover the soil, helps cycle nutrients, any excess nitrogen. It's really good at using that. And it also provides really good cover in the fall. We're talking about seed predation. Those predators need cover. And so corn stalks do some, but where you've got this nice thick lush grass, that gives them cover to work under there. And, you know, this can be where we've got misses in the corn, can be a year where we get a lot of seed shed. So not doing any fall tillage and leaving those weed seeds on the ground, just like Jean Paul said, is really key to letting as many of those die through predation or other methods. So, you know, here's some corn. You can see my soil is super rocky. So cultivation, yeah, nobody wants to farm that, but that's what I got. Is super rocky, and it can be hard to get good weed control. But that's about the point when we do our last cultivation right before canopy closure, where we'll go through. We have an air seeder that just drops the ryegrass down in between the rows on that fluff soil. The next time it rains, it kind of works its way in and then just grows really, really slow underneath the soil. It doesn't compete with it at all. But what you have in the fall, as the corn senesces and the canopy opens up, this stuff really takes off. You do have to be careful in the spring that it doesn't go to seed, or it can become a really big problem, especially in winter. We haven't had it be a problem yet. The other really nice thing is it It helps dry the soil in the fall when you're trying to get on there to combine. It also gives you some traction because it creates a real nice mat if it's a little wet. So our next year, we would go to buckwheat, and buckwheat is a light feeder. So we've gone from a heavy feeder to a light feeder. And this gives us our bare fallow period because buckwheat's planted later in the season around beginning of July, late June. And the other thing we like is, as corn stalks decompose, they've got a lot of lignin in them, so they tie up a lot of nitrogen. So going to buckwheat that doesn't like a lot of nitrogen works really well. Another thing I like about buckwheat is because it smothers the weeds, you can end up with this really nice, clean seed bed that you can line up a no-till event if you do it right and if the weather cooperates. So we're always looking at this as a chance. In organic agriculture, no-till is really difficult to pull off, but this lines us up between the bare fallow and the smother crop for a possible no-till event. And buckwheat's interesting in that if you can get the weeds down and get the buckwheat in and it gets a head start on the weeds, it can outcompete anything. But it is a really poor competitor if the weeds have an advantage. So you got to make sure to give it the advantage. And buckwheat really is great at controlling, those tough perennial weeds like quackgrass, bindweed, Canadian thistle. Those are really difficult to control on an organic farm. So, I find this to be I would never not grow buckwheat. Because I don't see how in my system or an organic cropping system, you're going to be able to control perennial weeds without having that bare fallow and buckwheat phase in there. So we swath our buckwheat, and when we combine it, we chop the straw in anticipation of doing some no-till. And then if we've got a nice clean field, and I would say nice clean field happens maybe 60% of the time. It doesn't happen all the time, but where it's clean, we'll go in and we'll no-till rye right into that stubble. And that's kind of what it looks like. So you can see there's not a lot of weeds growing there. And that's no-tilled into that stubble. It's a nice coarse mat. And we've had great success with this. If we didn't get good weed control, what we'll do is we'll put winter wheat in. When we put winter wheat in, we need to put some chicken manure on it for fertility, which necessitates doing at least one tillage pass. So we'll just kind of switch the crops because we've got 2 opportunities to get winter wheat in. So that 3rd year, we've got that planted. Rye no-till on the clean fields, which is a medium feeder, and then we grow hard red winter and soft white winter wheat, which is a heavier feeder. We'll go either or depending, and then that will get clover frost seeded in it. And you can see I really like the amount of mulch that this rye keeps on the soil, just in terms of protecting the soil. And then, there's basically a crop that we've seeded into our wheat that has controlled the weeds under the wheat, because it's very competitive, and it's going to act as both cover for predators, for any weeds that get shed. It's going to fix nitrogen, build organic matter. We always chop all our straw back on the soil to try to negate some of the negative effects of all the tillage we're doing. So, so year 4 and 5 is typically red clover. Sometimes we'll only have it in for a year. Sort of depends. We've been using some newer varieties of clover that are more phytophthora resistant, that have lasted better. And so this gives us a fallow period to sort of let the soil rest. Again, John Paul alluded to the fact that on a vegetable farm, this is much more difficult to do. So we feel really lucky that we're able to put red clover in, and one of the other things I like about red clover is it's got a really strong taproot, helps break up some of the plow pan that we get from all the tillage that we're doing. Fixes nitrogen, obviously. And what we typically do is sort of split it. The first year, we usually do some harvesting on it, and the second year is our year to sort of just cut it and let it lay on the ground, and sort of a year to give back to the soil, so to speak, to replenish and not draw nutrients out. So, that would look at when we do the harvest year, we're taking the first year off, first cutting off its baleage, selling that to organic dairy farmers. And then the second growth, we combine clover seed. And this is a really nice way to put pretty much all the organic matter back on the soil, but still get a really actually nice paying crop off of it. So this would be, you'd swap the second cutting after it went to seed, and then let it dry down. And you can see you want it as black and funky looking as it can possibly be. So we'll swap it and then let it really dry out, rake it into windrows, and then use a pickup head. And then there's screens you can put into your combine, 3mm round screens. And then there's your clover seed. And that's, 100 to 250 pounds per acre at $3 a pound. It's not bad for what you're doing there. And drier years are better than wet years. We don't always get a good clover crop off of that. So after we've done the clover, the next year, we're going to go to spring wheat. Spring wheat's another heavy feeder, so we're plowing that clover down. A lot of nitrogen. Spring wheat likes a lot of nitrogen. We'll take that up and get a nice crop in. And again, we're going and we're planting in the very early spring. And we've been experimenting with no tilling into stubble, like even in the beginning of March, to get our spring wheat in early. And this allows time after we've taken the spring wheat off in late July, early August, to do again a little bit of summer fallow tillage if we want, or put in a smother crop like buckwheat. That is a time of year where there's nowhere else in the rotation do we have opportunity to do a little bit of tillage if we need it. So it opens up that window of opportunity for us. It also allows us to get our winter grain in a timely fashion. And sometimes we'll go through with like a disc ripper or something like that, where we think we have some real compaction problems. The soil's nice and dry at that time of year, and you can get good shatter. That's the spring wheat coming up. Obviously, the spring grains, you can see in there that it's a little weeds getting started. And this is a 3 or 4 leaf stage, and this is where we can go in. I didn't really talk about mechanical weed control because it's going to get covered, but we can go in there with what's called a tine weeder and go right over the top of the crop and just tear and bury all those little weeds. And after you get done with this, the first time I did it, I came home, I told my wife, I said, I think I'm going to puke, because I thought for sure that I had killed this crop. I mean, it was just buried. And she went out and said, all right, I'm going to take some pictures. And she went out, I should have put that in here, took some pictures of it. And it looked like you field cultivated it, but spring wheat in particular, more so than even oats, it seems to really relish a good thrashing, because that stuff comes back like gangbusters. Like the more you beat the snot out of it, the more it likes it and comes back thick. I think it somehow initiates tillering. And so as bad as this might look, it actually helps the crop. And well, that was the field that I told you that I thought I had killed. And it honestly ended up being the cleanest spring wheat I ever grew. It was the first year at a time here. So maybe it was beginner's luck. But that field, if you looked at it after I time weeded it, you'd say that I killed it. This spring, my conventional dairy farmer neighbor, we were growing spring wheat on one of the main roads, and we went through with the field cultivator, and he called me up that night. He was like, "Thor, what the hell did you do to that spring weed? It looks so beautiful. Looks like it's gonna die." And I said, "Well, just give it some time and it'll come out of it." So for a summer fellow, just a little bit of a nice tool we sort of discovered was using a chisel plow with 22-inch ridge till sweeps on it. I don't know if any of you guys use this, but what we do is we just run that about 4 inches under the ground, and it's got this huge amount of overlap, so no weed can duck it. And it basically just, it's like taking a giant knife and just cutting underneath the soil, lifts the soil a little bit, but leaves the trash on the surface. There's us with our big chisel plow going through and doing it. And it's really cool because you can just grab a hold of the soil and pick it up, and it's like somebody cut it with a knife. And so it does sort of a minimum job of disturbance, but a maximum job of dislocating the weeds from their roots and killing them. And so we've been experimenting with this tool a lot and enjoying it. And then so we would go in, we have a min-till planter, and we'll go into that stubble and plant our winter grain in. And then we'd have winter grain for that year. And we either put rye or wheat in, and again, seeding in September. And then we would go back to corn and the beginning of the rotation again. So, you know, we cross seed into that winter grain and then use the nitrogen from that clover crop to grow it. And maybe there's basically 2 times in that rotation where we're adding fertilizer. One is ahead of winter wheat, where we're using chicken manure, and one is ahead of corn, where we would put the chicken manure on in the fall of the year that we are going to put the corn in. And that's it basically. And then some starter fertilizer. But other than that, we're not using any other fertilizer but lime. So, so that's basically our rotation. Going to get a lot more talking about all the different aspects of what goes into a good weed control program. But, you know, to reiterate, for me, I found that my rotation is my most important weapon in terms of, you know, keeping weeds in check. And I'm not going to say we don't have weeds, we do have weeds, but I don't feel like they cause us great economic harm anyway. So that's it. Is there any questions about what I said? Or yeah. Red clover instead of white clover. Why do I plant red clover? Seed is cheap, makes better hay. White clover grows really, really low. I don't know. Does anybody make white clover hay? Maybe a little bit in a grass mix. You do? He makes white clover hay. Red clover grows really, really well in my area. I think all over New York State. Frost seeds really well. I mean, I don't think I've ever frost seeded red clover and not had it produce a nice crop of red clover. White clover seed is really expensive. So in terms of just expense, because we use it twice in the rotation, I find red clover to just work really easy and makes a lot of biomass and makes really nice hay that dairy farmers really want. And I'm able to combine my own seed, so it saves me a lot of money. I mean, the only seed I buy is hybrid corn seed. Otherwise, all the seed that we use on the farm, I grow myself, and then we have a seed cleaning operation, so we're cleaning it ourselves. So, you know, if you look at what seeds cost these days, I mean, it's ridiculous what they're charging you. So this allows us to kind of grow our own cover crop. So, I buy the annual ryegrass. Yeah.
This question is for you and John. Soil stand analysis or
so John Paul probably does it a lot more extensively than I do. We do every 3 years, and we try to do it in the late summer, and we try to do it at the same time every year. Just so, you know, I read Klaus Martins, I think, you do it every 2 years. So we find that every 3 years is probably good enough for us. And I don't do any tissue analysis. Do you, John Paul? He does, yeah. So maybe that's more important on a more high value crop like vegetables, but I haven't gotten that far into soil fertility management to do tissue analysis. Yeah, one of our big things is pH, because we're in a really low pH area. So, pH has a lot to do with how well the microbes work in your soil as well. So for us as someone who's, feeding the soil to feed the crop, it's really important that we have our pHs in the mid-6s so that we have good activity of microbes and other things such as that. So, yeah.
So this is, and I think your rotation, what was your average dollars revenue per year, or what's your target? You got corn, and 1 year you got rice. So how does that work? It seems conventional world that you dollars on the table, that's your goal.
This is true. So this is where the marketing aspect comes in. So by taking a crop like rye, putting it through my seed cleaner or grinding it into rye flour, we're actually getting almost $20 a bushel for rye. If you get 70 bushel rye times $20 a bushel, you're not doing too bad. And you really I don't have any fertilizer into it. I save my own seed. A lot of times we've no-tilled it. So it actually provides us with a good revenue. And part of why that works is by doing a value added enterprise. So, I would say corn probably gives us the best, total revenue. So in order to square in my brain all these different things, I try to look at my farm as like an ecosystem, economic ecosystem, because some of those years you're not getting really much out of it. But as John Paul was saying with the Nordells, they're sort of looking at a year maybe where you're lining yourself up to put a crop in that's going to make you a lot of money. So, year in, year out, it might go a little bit like this, but the overall effect on the farm is net positive. So, and part of that is being able to market the crop. So there you go. Didn't answer your question.
So the chicken manure is composted, dry, and it does stimulate the.
Yeah, so the chicken manure is dry layer manure, or where we've got a situation where we've got too much phosphorus, we'll use a broiler manure, which is lower in phosphorus and higher in potassium. So we use both different kinds. That comes in dry on tractor trailer trucks. We work with a couple of poultry farms. And your second question was, well, yeah, it's going to stimulate weeds, but what we have done is we put it in ahead of winter wheat in the fall, where it may stimulate some of those winter annual weeds, but between the red clover and the winter wheat, we're able to outcompete them. Now in corn, when we put it on, what I did initially was I used to spread the chicken manure in the spring, disc it in, and then plant the corn. That was a real no-no, because what I was doing was I was fertilizing the weeds. So now what we're doing is we're putting it on the previous year, fertilizing the cover crop, then plowing the cover crop down. So all that chicken manure has been either incorporated into the cover crop, or the stuff that's still on the surface is getting put down 6 inches. And then we're just putting fertilizer in the row with the starter. And that, actually should have mentioned that. That has made a huge difference in terms of weed control in corn, because we used to the weeds would go ballistic. And that was one of my early mistakes that we luckily corrected. But that's a good question. So, yeah, is there any of the cover crops that take up more phosphorus than other ones? I actually don't know the answer to that question. Does anyone know the answer to that question? I don't know what their phosphorus uptake is. Yeah, buckwheat has the ability to mineralize phosphorus in the soil. It actually has an exudate. It's a type of acid that can pull phosphorus out of the soil. Now, how much phosphorus it actually pulls up to draw down phosphorus, I don't know, but that's actually a really interesting question. I've been a little bit more concerned in terms of the cover crop with not letting nitrogen leach down through into the soil. And that's where the annual ryegrass is really excellent because its root system is very extensive and goes down quite deep and is really good at capturing nitrogen and holding it. So, you know, as are wheat and rye and things like that. Buckwheat would be terrible at pulling up nitrogen. It actually, you want to try to limit nitrogen with buckwheat, or it tends to get too tall and fall over. So that's a good question. All right, thank you.